All right, this is video 22 on race and pregnancy, and we're going to be focusing on the discrepancy in pregnancy outcomes between blacks and whites in the United States, and specifically the high rate of mothers dying within 1 year of giving birth amongst African Americans due to problems associated with pregnancy. I'm also along the way going to talk in general about medical racism and about testimonial injustice and relationships between structural injustice and individual prejudice, that sort of thing. But first I want to tie this back to our core book, the thing that we're all reading, right? The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. One of the recurring themes in The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks is the Lacks family's continual encounters with medical racism. So the last chapter you would have read before this video was chapter 21, Night Doctors, which is largely actually about the relationship between the medical establishment and the African American community. So as far as the main plot of the chapter goes, this is another part of the story where Skloot is winning the trust of members of the Lacks family. She has to pass through various gatekeepers, right, to get access to the Lacks family, because the Lacks family has been hurt so many times in the past, people are protective of them. So at this point, she's won over the confidence of Sonny Lacks, and Sonny is going to introduce her to his older brother Lawrence, whom he describes as the Big Kahuna. And Skloot manages to win over Lawrence in much the same way that she wins over other people, which is just by being a good listener. Just showing basic aspects of kindness. So Lawrence makes some food for her, and she eats it. And then when Sonny comes back, he says, "Looks like you passed the test," pointing to my empty plate. Right? She also figures out what it is that Lawrence actually doesn't know. And fills in some basic information rather than just throwing information at him. She figures out what questions he needs answered and responds to those. So she's really doing an excellent job here. Well, the other thing that we learned in this chapter is that the Lacks family does not trust Johns Hopkins. In fact, Day has gangrene from his toes to his knee. Day is Henrietta Lacks' widower, and will probably need to have something amputated, some portion of his leg amputated. But Day refuses, and she says he didn't want doctors cutting on him like they did Henrietta. Right? Sonny, at 52, his oldest son feels the same way. The doctors are saying he needs angioplasty, but he swears he'll never do it. Now, the Lackses aren't the only African American family to distrust the medical establishment. And I want to return to the topic of medical racism to explain why this is. And like I said before, I'm specifically going to look at racial discrepancies in pregnancy outcomes. But first I want to look at more of the things that Skloot focuses on. So, Babette Lacks announces that she wouldn't even go to Johns Hopkins to get her toenails cut. And at this point, the members of the Lacks family begin repeating a story that is common amongst African Americans in the Baltimore area, that in fact there are night doctors who travel around and kidnap people off the streets, African Americans, to perform experiments on. Now this is an urban legend, this is a myth, but it stems from a perception of something that is real. Well, okay, just for starters, there are no such thing as night doctors, and that's because you really don't have to snatch people off the streets for medical experiments. And we'll see a little bit later, Zakaria actually volunteers for medical experimentation because he's desperate. So, yeah, that's a separate topic. But the legend of night doctors is a product of distrust, and distrust exists for a reason. And so actually, Skloot goes all the way back to the slave era, and I think that's entirely appropriate. So this is actually a slide from my previous presentation when I was talking about the Tuskegee syphilis study, talking about experiments on slaves in the slave era. So John Brown had his skin cut and blistered by Dr. Thomas Hamilton in an effort to prove that blacks had thicker skins than whites. So again, this is a man was essentially just tortured to prove a crackpot theory. Samuel Cartwright argued that slaves must have so here's this weird thing. He says they must have a mental disorder that would make them run away from their masters. So a lot of the medicine in the slave era was trying to rationalize slavery itself. So you start with the assumption that slavery is fine, and then the behavior of the people who actually experience slavery needs to be explained away. Cartwright also invented the spirometer, in order to prove that blacks had weaker lung capacity. So that's some review. Another really famous example of experiments on enslaved people was the work of J. Marion Sims, who is actually known as the father of modern gynecology. And for a while there were statues of him. He was considered a great doctor because he discovered a lot of things, but he discovered them by experimenting on enslaved women. So Sims learned to repair fistulas by practicing surgeries on enslaved women. And when he did this, he did not use anesthesia, although later on, after he'd perfected the techniques on black slaves without anesthesia, he did them on elite white women, and he did use anesthesia. Anesthesia was pretty primitive then, but it was he thought it was worth using for at least the elite women. So he said of his experiments that they were so painful none but a woman could have borne them. Lucy's agony, one of the enslaved women that he experimented on, was extreme. She was much prostrated, and I thought she was going to die. After she had recovered entirely from the effects of this unfortunate experiment, I put her on the table to examine. One thing that I thought was interesting here is that there's actually a bit of intersectionality between racism and sexism here. Both blacks and women are believed to be more resistant to pain. And with women, this is often associated with childbirth. The idea is women have to be more resistant to pain because they give birth to children, but because childbirth is so painful. But you don't actually have any evidence for that. It's based on just ideas about the nature of womanhood. And we'll see more of that in Alison Reiheld's article, which we will be reading this week. So in any case, Lucy here has her pain twice discounted, once because she's black and once because she's a woman. All right, so that's way back in the slave era. We talked about, but there's a continuous history of abuse from the slave era to the present. And we talked about the Tuskegee syphilis experiments. I also want to talk about things that were specifically done at Johns Hopkins that come up actually in passing. Rebecca Skloot mentions them. One is the medical tests, the Maryland tests for criminal potential. So, for a while in the late 60s and early 70s, there was this hypothesis that people with the chromosomal abnormality 47XYY were unusually prone to criminal behavior. So these are people who have an extra Y chromosome, and the Y chromosome is the chromosome that makes a baby have male features. So the thought was that if you have two of them, you're going to be criminal because criminality is understood as male, right? There was never a shred of evidence for this, and it's now been completely debunked. And yet this idea that people with an extra Y chromosome are prone to criminal behavior is still floating around there. If you like the Alien movies, and I do, the third Alien movie is on a prison planet, and the premise there is that all the prisoners have an extra Y chromosome, and that's why they're so violent. But again, this is about as realistic as the space alien that bleeds acid everywhere. Okay, in any case, researchers used 7,500 blood samples of black boys enrolled at a Johns Hopkins free medical program. They did this without their consent, looking for signs of criminal behavior and signs and for this chromosomal abnormality. The study was halted by the ACLU, who were worried, fairly reasonably, that boys identified as with 47XYY would be unfairly stigmatized. All right, and the other one that gets mentioned is a series of experiments an experiment that was litigated in the case of Grimes versus Kennedy Krieger. What happened is researchers from Hopkins performed various levels of lead abatement in people's homes and apartments around Baltimore. They then encouraged landlords to rent those properties to families with children so that they could monitor the children's blood levels. Families were not informed of these dangers even after one child developed lead poisoning, and the case was settled out of court. So there is a history of medical racism, and that is part of the reason why people like the Laxes distrust doctors. And even if the story of night doctors isn't true, plenty of other things are. All right, so now I want to focus on the main, an aspect of race in medicine that has gotten a lot of attention recently, and this is the problem with race and pregnancy outcomes. The CDC monitors pregnancies, right? They have a pregnancy mortality surveillance system. Actually, let's just go over for a second and take a look at this webpage because it's pretty interesting. Okay, so the CDC monitors pregnancy-related deaths, and on the webpage they explain what's going on there. Basically, they look at death certificates for people who died within a year of giving birth, and then they look at the cause of death and determine whether the cause of death was related to the pregnancy. This is an important number. In general, pregnancy-related deaths have been going down throughout the 20th century, right? As technology advanced, In the 19th century and earlier, pregnancy was a really risky activity. Many women died in childbirth, and that was just considered a part of life. Advances in medical technology have brought the number of women dying in childbirth down dramatically, to the extent that the possibility of death in childbirth really doesn't haunt people or affect life decisions in the same way that it did in 200 years ago. Nevertheless, this general good trend reversed in the 1980s. And so you see, this is pregnancy-related deaths from 1987 to 2017. And this is deaths per 100,000, right? In 1987, it was 7 deaths per 100,000, and now it's gone up to 17 deaths per 100,000. And this is an indicator. This is an indicator that things are going wrong in the healthcare system. So we'll just keep scrolling down here, and we can find more helpful information. One thing is that the difference, that the rise in pregnancy-related deaths is not spread equally across the population. It is focused on non-Hispanic Black women. So the ratio of deaths here is 41.7 to 11.6. It comes out to be about 3.25. So a little more than 3 times as many deaths in Black women as white women. And Asian women and Hispanic and Latino women both have mortality rates that are similar to white women, but Native Americans and Alaskan Natives are closer to the mortality rate for African Americans. And this is obviously significant. Basically, the causes of the rise in pregnancy-related mortality are not biological, they're social. They have something to do with what is happening with marginalized groups. And so the last part of this video, I just want to explore what might be causing that. And one thing I want to do is go back show you a slide that I showed you in the very first PowerPoint, the very first video for this class. I want to talk about different aspects of racism. On the one hand, there is what we can think of as individual racism. And this can either be conscious or implicit. But so you have individuals who might be consciously prejudiced. They might be just white supremacists. Well, it turns out that's far more common than I really thought it was like 5 years ago. It's kind of scary. A lot of times people, though, focus on implicit bias. So these are unconscious beliefs or attitudes. And these are really widespread. And that's been understood for a very long time. If you get raised in a racist society, that's going to seep into the background of all of your attitudes. One thing that I want to emphasize more in this course is not individual bias, whether conscious or unconscious, but structural injustice. And we're defining these as unjust situations that are the result of structural processes that many people participate in. So rather than looking at an individual's actions, you look at how people collectively continue to uphold institutions and patterns and distributions of resources that are themselves a source of racism or injustice. So here's the question. African American women are 3 to 4 times more likely than white women to die from complications of pregnancy. Why? Well, I want to look at two kinds of explanations, structural and individual. On the structural level, we can talk about access to healthcare and weathering. And then on the individual level, we're going to talk about trust and communication and the false beliefs of doctors. So access is pretty important. There's a movie available at theatlantic.com, a short 7-minute mini documentary called Maternity Desert. And this is about the inability of many people, including a woman that they profile in this video, to get easy access to medical care, including prenatal care, right? So this is actually the modern equivalent of what happened back in Henrietta Lacks. Remember, in the 1950s, Henrietta Lacks had to travel hours to get to a hospital that would treat a colored person, as they said then, right? The hospitals near her were whites only. Well, actually, this is still kind of the way things work. And I've put this video up. You can watch it. It takes 7 minutes. I encourage you to watch it. The link is in this module. Because as it turns out, you still have to travel. A lot of people still have to travel a long way to get maternity care. So this is a map of Washington, D.C., the nation's capital. That's the Potomac River on the left and the Anacostia River feeding into it on the right. The area to the southeast of the Anacostia River is called Anacostia. It is a almost entirely African American neighborhood. It is also a maternity desert. There is no there is no prenatal care available there. So in fact, Amber, the person we follow in this video, like Henrietta Lacks, has to travel an hour and a half. Henrietta Lacks had to travel 2 hours, I think, but has to travel several hours to get basic health care. It's no longer because hospitals are whites only. In this case, it's just because the hospitals don't exist. All right, that's access to healthcare. That's clearly a factor. Another interesting theory is the weathering hypothesis. So the weathering hypothesis is this idea that, well, here I'll just use the words of the author who developed the hypothesis. Her name is Eileen Geronimus. Blacks experience early health deterioration as a result of the cumulative impact of repeated experience with social or economic adversity and political marginalization. What does that mean? Well, actually, there's a nice episode of Code Switch on NPR that discusses this and then interviews Geronimus. And they give the example of being profiled while out shopping by, a store detective. This is, what they call a microaggression. You might not think it's a big deal, but it does, in fact, when you are unfairly profiled by law enforcement or by a private security guard, it creates a stress reaction. It activates all of those fight or flight hormones. And we know very well that stress reactions cause wear and tear on the body, and over time that accumulates. So the weathering hypothesis is weathering is hypothesized to play a role in pregnancy outcomes excess mortality and disability. And they try to measure weathering by talking about something called allostatic load, which measures the effects of stressors over a long period of time. And that is higher for blacks than whites, even after you control for things like poverty. The original hypothesis, though, was made for specifically for pregnancy outcomes. And it's based on this interesting observation that the discrepancy in pregnancy outcomes doesn't kick in until women get older. And so the hypothesis was, when it comes specifically to pregnancy outcomes, that cumulative damage over over many years worsens people's health and thus makes later pregnancies higher risk. All right. So those are structural things, right? Where hospitals are located is the result of a process, a social process that many people participate in, right? No one person decides where a hospital goes. It's determined by market forces and committees and investors and government officials. Weathering is the same way. It is almost necessarily a communal process because it's about the cumulative effect of daily interactions with absolutely everyone. There are also things going wrong with medical racism at the individual level. And one that has come up a lot recently is problems with communication, or as we put it in philosophy, testimonial injustice. And the easiest example of this, one of the most prominent ones, is the recent case Serena Williams. So Serena Williams has a history of blood clots, and she's an athlete. She's very much aware of her body and what might go right or wrong with it. While she was recovering from childbirth, she realizes she's short of breath, and she asks the doctor for an anticoagulant and a CT scan because she thinks that she might be having another pulmonary embolism. And they don't believe her, right? And so the nurse doesn't believe her. Eventually, she gets through to a doctor who performs an ultrasound on her legs and finally is able to believe her. There's a nice essay by Damon Young at Very Smart Brothers, which is part of The Root. It's a nice blog I read sometimes. But Young is a really powerful writer, so his essay is called "My Mom Wasn't as Lucky," talking about differences in aspects of medical racism, outcomes in medical racism. But this is the part that I found really powerful. You'd think that if medical professionals would trust any opinion on someone feeling not quite right, it would be the opinion of a world-class athlete. Someone whose body isn't just a finely tuned instrument, but exists as an actual industry. But, that's actually not what happens. And then he goes on, I'll just read the bottom part of this. This despite the fact that Williams has a history of clotting issues and literally almost died from it in 2003. And again, this is Serena fucking Williams. And Young's point is that if Serena Williams can't get respect, people like his mother have it much worse. So this is what we previously referred to as testimonial injustice. Testimonial injustice is when you are wronged because people don't give you the right amount of credibility. And the most common case of this is that someone is not believed because of who they are. And we read an essay by Alison Reichelt where she talks about 3 classes of individuals who are commonly disbelieved by doctors. African Americans, women, and fat people, actually. And obviously intersectionality becomes an issue here. And again, as we saw earlier, also with both African Americans and women, there are stories about higher levels of pain tolerance that lead to, as we saw previously, pain being under-medicated in these groups. All right. There was also a recent Twitter tweet storm. A bunch of tweets that went viral a while back. Where a nurse describes another case where a black woman under her care has her pain meds undertreated. What happens is the patient is on Dilaudid, but she's not responding. The nurse wants to switch to morphine, and she has to go up the chain of command until the doctor who finally authorizes the shift, which turned out to be the right move medically, was actually an African American doctor. All right. The last thing I want to talk about is the false beliefs of doctors. This is another example of individual prejudice. So what we were looking at before was just doctors don't listen to certain classes of people, and African Americans are one of them. The other one that comes up is that we've talked about before, specifically in reference to pain meds, was doctors having false beliefs. So we looked at a study by Hoffman et al. On doctors. Actually, they weren't looking most of the time at practicing doctors. They were looking at med students and then later at interns. But they got some results that indicate a possible cause for the undertreatment of pain in African Americans. Turns out many doctors have false beliefs about race. And they had a list of false statements mixed in with some true statements, and asked doctors to state whether they were true. And some of these false beliefs were things that go back to the slave era. This crazy idea that, for instance, people of African descent have thicker skin was on the list, and a lot of doctors checked yes to that. Doctors who had these false beliefs were more likely to underestimate the amount of pain a patient was in. And again, this wasn't done in the field. This was done with medical descriptions. So it's that's a thing to watch out for. And one reason why you might not buy this particular line of explanation. And then finally, doctors who had these false beliefs were also less likely to prescribe pain meds. So we've got a picture now of medical racism, and I've been focusing on the pregnancy outcomes and the pain outcomes, the pain treatment, because these are things that have been studied a lot recently, although the whole thing has a long and ugly history. I want to circle back, though, to the basic distinction in kinds of racism or ways that racism is replicated or upheld. So some of the things that we looked at are the result of individual biases, perhaps consciously held beliefs, like blacks have thicker skin, or maybe just implicit bias, a background tendency to dismiss the testimony of certain kinds of people. But there were also structural injustices. For instance, where hospitals are located. Well, it's an open question now, right? What is the role of these different aspects of racism in creating the racial inequalities that we see? And I don't have an answer to that. But if you want to think about it or write about it, this is a question that needs to be answered.